My name's Julien, sorry, and I'll talk briefly because we have a discussion. As you know, I'm an artist, so I knew Jason. I met Jason when I was 19, 19. It was my second semester, 18 or 19, at UCLA, and I was hesitating between two majors and decided to do art after having him as my TA and Paul McCarthy as my teacher. So that kind of changed things. I've been trying to think about what I could bring to this discussion. It's really fascinating to hear all of these different, and for me as an artist also, very different perspectives on artworks and what it means to make art. And I just want to start by going back to what Christian said on the first day when he was talking about attention and intention, because I think that's a very beautiful way to look at something like Jason's estate or Jason's work. Jason obviously had intentions. He also had forms of attention to certain details, to things like dust, the cleanliness of certain things, the arrangement of certain things, but also the kind of experience that a viewer would have and the kind of interaction that a viewer had with his work, and reciprocally that he in turn had with his work and the public. This is the first piece I saw by Jason, and it was in the parking lot of the grad studios at UCLA, and it was called More, M-O-R-E, More, M-O-R, Morals and Morass. And he essentially dressed up in a fat suit as a Middle Eastern man, and it's a very complex piece and difficult to even start to explain, but I'm just going to flip through images. Oh, great, it works. Basically, it's emblematic of the work I remember him doing when he was in school, which is work that really took advantage of that privileged situation, meaning a situation wherein you're showing work to your peers who are following you and seeing what you're doing, but you're also it's a controlled environment. You pretty much know everyone who's coming in, and you can interact with the work. You can talk alongside the work. In fact, you're encouraged to. And what he did is he took that and ran with it, and ended up in many of his pieces taking on a type of persona with which he would kind of guide or talk, or I think the best word actually is allegorize, or so it was a kind of fabulation and allegorization of his work in situ and live. It felt at times like he was explaining something, and at times like he was interpreting it. There was a moment, I think, even from that first encounter with his work, where you felt like, and it's also something you could see in the way he talked about his work, the work was very much an agent, which he interacted with in this different way than we did. But definitely was a separation between him and the work. And in fact, many of the times when I heard him talking about a project, he would talk about the work in the large sense of his oeuvre, leading him to a project, leading him to take a certain risk, make a certain commitment, ask an institution to try and do something. This is another piece much later. It's 1998, so that piece was More Morals and Morass is 1991, and it's called The Creation Myth. And to me, it's one of many pieces that is emblematic of how he first started to work within a gallery setting, meaning he kind of stepped back from the performative, let's say, docent role, which wasn't really a docent, but a kind of storytelling role, and went on to create installations that themselves were either active or activated. This piece, for example, has a machine, you may have seen it at Hauser and Wirth last year, blue smoke rings. It has also elements that can be activated, that are often activated during the installation. For example, contraption whose name I forget. It's basically like a forklift, a small forklift that he would that was the prick, because this piece is meant to be a kind of metaphor or map of the way the human mind works, and the prick was something that was always running up against the walls and trying to break through them and make a hole. But he in these installations sort of stepped back and let both the installation be active, but also included a lot of videos of him talking and talking through the work, and I believe that was also something that he did with the people he worked with at the galleries, leading them through the work, telling them what everything meant or signified for him. And this is another shot. And this is just a brief aside to show, it's a terrible picture, and I'm sorry, I wanted to find a picture this morning, and it was the best thing I could find. This is a very atypical installation. The most beautiful images of it are the installation that he made at the Secession in Vienna in the Klimt Frieze room, which is a room with a frieze mural. And it's an example of, we were talking about this with Christian yesterday, Jason's minimalism. He could make also installations that were very minimal. And in this case, the installation is just 2 rows of video games that you could play, let's say antique video games. And the piece is called A Few Free Years, in reference to the years that so many of us lost and are losing playing video games. And then I'll just go quickly through these. This is Perfect World, which was brought up earlier, which was maybe definitely his most massive and large-scale installation, which he did in Hamburg. As you can see, there's this pipe which he used for the installation, which he then started to reuse to make other pieces, and you can see traces of it even in the Black Pussy installation shots that we saw in the first presentation. And then I'm going to end just with a pyrofoam. Sorry, I keep doing that. The pyrofoam is in a way an extension of that logic of the pipes in the Perfect World. It's a moment where Jason went from, as you can see in his early installations, he composed by means of there's really no word for it in English, but there's a great word for it in French, which is bricolage. Bricolage in French is when you cobble something together with what you have in hand. And Jason did that in the most extended sense of the word, meaning he would drive around LA and he had sort of some emblematic stores that he frequented, like Costco, Home Depot, different electronic stores. And he would cobble from these ready-made objects that he would buy. He would fashion, cobble, build up, invent also other objects. And so that's maybe a first thing I can say in relation to some of the things that have been discussed in this installation, in the symposium, is that if you just think about the word material, a material for most artists is a very clear thing. It's whatever you use to make the work. Painter uses paint and canvas, and so on and so forth. For Jason, that division is very tenuous, and in fact is something that he toyed with often, because not only was he using unconventional materials, so store-bought items, but he would also even recycle elements from previous works and previous installations into a new work. And so there were moments when a previous work would become the material for a new work. And another thing which I think was touched upon at one point, but I'm not sure, there's so many conversations, is that he chose objects, he chose his material for every reason that you could ever choose something, because it had a link to his life, because it had a metaphorical resonance, because it had a formal property that he liked, because of its color, because of its shape, because of its function, because of where he bought it, because of the person he bought it from. I won't go into it, but the Fiero that you saw on the lawn of the Brand Foundation, there's a beautiful story about the person that he bought it from, which then became part of the work very much. And by the same token, if you think of the classic Duchampian approach to the ready-made, Duchamp famously said that the big problem that he had with the ready-made was that he wanted an aesthetically neutral object. He wanted something that would just read as, for example, a shovel. And the problem he encountered was that he realized that when he showed the shovel that he had purchased in, say, 1950, 10 years later, or 1940, that shovel had become quaint and had become a kind of artifact. It had lost its neutrality, which I would argue maybe never really existed. And that's something that I, in many ways, learned from Jason, because for Jason there was a beautiful specificity to everything that he purchased and worked into his installation, including the most banal objects. We were talking at lunch with Christian about his use of buckets. Buckets were a very important element, sculptural, metaphorical, conceptual element in his work, and he tended to like orange Home Depot buckets, which in turn matched the orange Home Depot extension cords, which he tended to use. And that's just a small example of an object that is both generic and specific, and of the ways in which he could, even with the most generic mass-produced object, develop a kind of personal, idiosyncratic relationship. So I'll end on something which is maybe a bit complicated to explain, which is, what do we do with a work like this now? I can't obviously answer for conservators, but I can start to answer maybe for someone who both likes his work or loves his work, but also for viewers in general. I had wanted, I don't want to take up too much time, but if ever you guys can, any of you can get a hold of this book, there are beautiful passages. It's a beautiful book. To my mind, maybe the richest book on his way of thinking. And one of the things that's very interesting to notice about this book is that it's fashioned after a dictionary, meaning it is a lexicon. And a dictionary, if for all of us who have used one, which is everyone, is a book that you don't read in a linear fashion, unless that's your intention. But a dictionary is something that you jump around in. You go from one entry to another, to another, to another, and there's a sort of unmapped dynamic to the way you interact with a book. And I think that in and of itself is maybe a very nice and compact metaphor for the kind of relationship that Jason wanted people to have with his work, because it was also the relationship that he had while making his work with the world around him. Jason uses a certain amount of words here that really emblematize that let's say that fascination or insistence on a kind of mobility and a kind of instability. For example, he talks about something which he calls the approach. The approach is how you you come up against something, whether you drive up against a building and park, walk up to it, enter from underground, and the same holds for any kind of work. He also has different definitions of words like dynamic, or there are actually words that he puts in all caps as if he were going to define them and never does. For example, social interaction he has, but mobility. And I think what Jason was trying to communicate in that constant, let's say, constant search for synonyms for a type of, let's say, a type of life that the work could have, is that he was not someone who was unaware of the way his work existed without him. Because from the moment he started showing in galleries, his work was more often than not seen without him, and without him talking next to it. However, and I would say that this is something that you could say just as well of a Mark Rothko painting as of a Jason Rhoades installation, he was also very aware of the fact that, to the degree that from the moment that you take the work seriously and start to engage with it seriously, and start, for example, to look in his lexicon and try to parse together or piece together some of the ideas that the work generated for him, and that's a very important distinction, not that the work contained, but that the work generated, because I think that was the relationship he had with the work and that he wanted us to have. As soon as you engage with that, you'll see that even the most static installation has a life, and that life is the life of its ideas, the life of its concepts, the life of its forms, but also the very liveliness of your interaction with it. As you can see from all these installations, and as we saw in the first presentation, many of his pieces are pieces that you have to literally walk around in, that you have to walk within, inside of as well. And you're all, in that respect, you're very rarely seeing the piece as a whole. You're always seeing it from within a certain perspective. And I would say that even when you're looking above and down into the work, that's another perspective, among others, of a work of Jason's. And in that respect, I think that what we're left with is an incredible amount of things and a very rich work that simply asks us to make the effort of reading it, interacting it, engaging with it. And I'm going to read just a very short 2 sentences from the A to Z. It's not a passage that directly addresses this, but it does it in a kind of deviated way, namely in the contrast he draws between what he calls a brown box, which is one of the dictionary entries, and it's also an object that he used, these brown metal boxes that you put on the back of a pickup truck. And if you just dwell on what he says, the opposition he makes between that and a black box, I think you can start to see how this work can live on without him. So this is the definition. Brown box, object. Things can be put in and taken out again. Cage, that's another entry. For Jason Rhoades, the brown box from Deviations in Space, Various Virgins, is an everyday, commonplace version of the black box. And I think he's referring to the black box in airplanes. It does not contain ultimate truth, as the black box does, but it is the embodiment of dialogue and exchange. It can store secrets or banalities. What counts is not what is in it, but understanding the way it works. It is a piece of furniture that can be used to store theory, structures, and the tools for understanding the theory. The brown color of the standard version corresponds to the terracotta color of the Venus of Willendorf. So, and that's the end. But I think that's what, to me, Jason is more and more. There's a sense that something is contained, that something has to be unpacked, but I think now it's up to us to do that. Thank you.